You're listening to Queer Tasmania.
Queer Tasmania.
Queer Tasmania.
Queer Tasmania.
Queer Tasmania.
With Gary Wakefield.
Welcome back to Queer Tasmania. Rodney Croome is a name many of you have probably heard. He has been an advocate in this space since the 1980s, having been a major part of the push for decriminalisation of homosexuality in Tasmania, the marriage equality campaign nationally, and so many other things. One of Rodney's current roles is with Equality Tasmania, and our conversation reflected on some of the highlights of his previous work and what he and others are working on currently and where we hope to get some wins. We're calling this conversation The Queer State of the State. Thank you for coming in and having a chat with me today, Rodney.
Well, Gary, thanks for asking me. I appreciate it.
It's awesome to have you here. The first thing I want to ask is that you have been working in this space for such a long time, advocating and fighting for these protections for all of us since the 1980s. And you were famously, I remember the photo, famously arrested at Salamanca markets in 1988. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Did you know that was going to happen that day?
Well, we thought it might happen, but it was still a shock when it did. Just in terms of background, it was only a few months before that the then Tasmanian Gay Law Reform Group had formed, mainly a bunch of uni students, including myself. We felt that it was wrong, that we were criminals because we were in same-sex relationships, and we wanted to change the law. So we did the usual things that you do when you want a law to change. You write to the government and you start a petition. And we thought, how can we get signatures on this petition? We took it down to Salamanca Market and had a stall there. We didn't think much of it. I mean, we thought it'd be great visibility for our community, obviously, and an important way to get support for the law reform. At that stage, as some of your listeners might remember, Tasmania still had laws which criminalised all forms of sex between men, including consenting sex between adults in private, and the maximum penalty was 21 years in prison. And like I said, we wanted to highlight this, so we went down to Salamanca. The Hobart City Council ran the market and was appalled by our stall. In the words of one Hobart City councillor at that stage, quote, "We don't want any homosexuals in our family market."
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty awful. And so they banned the stall. They said it was too political, even though we were in between Amnesty International, the Wilderness Society, and Resistance. And we said, this is clearly discrimination. We're going to set the stall up again. And it was a couple of weeks between when we'd been banned and when the arrests occurred. We weren't sure if it was going to happen or when. But it was on that day. It was the 22nd of October, 1988. I'll never forget that date, when the council finally brought in the police. And those of us who were staffing the stall were arrested and taken away. The following week we were there again and the same happened. This time the police arrested all of those people around the stall. The council banned anyone from the market who had a copy of our petition or a poster that had the words gay or lesbian on it, or a pink triangle, which is a symbol, of course, of the LGBTIQA plus movement. The next week, a whole bunch of people turned up with copies of the petition and posters, and they were all arrested. Over 7 consecutive Saturday mornings, 130 people were arrested in defence of that store, while hundreds protested from just outside the market space. That was and remains the biggest act of gay right civil disobedience in Australian history. But back to your question, no, we didn't really know when it would happen. We expected it might, but it was still a shock when it did. I think for a lot of LGBTIQA plus people, it's a shock when we first come up against discrimination, when it's right in front of us, when someone says something really prejudiced, or when we're denied a service or treated in a disfavourable way because of who we are, because we're brought up to think that we're all going to be treated equally. And then when we come out and we find that's not always the case. Now, like you said, there's a famous photo of me being arrested, but it's important for people to realise that it wasn't just me. There were those 130 others, several of whom, like me, were arrested multiple times. And many brave people who came along to protest and stepped into the market to be arrested, even with they weren't prepared for that. They hadn't come to do that. They did it because they couldn't believe the injustice unfolding before their eyes. We have to remember the thousands and thousands of LGBTIQA plus people in Tasmania and across Australia and across the world who have done the same thing. When prejudice and discrimination is suddenly in front of them, they don't turn and walk away, they challenge it. That's when history changes. That's when our community moves forward. And it's happening in 100 different ways right across the world right now.
Yeah. Where did you get that feeling from? Was there an example that you were following, or was it just like a gut instinct, like I have to do this?
I can't say I knew a lot about queer history at that stage. So I wasn't necessarily following an example of, say, Stonewall or something like that in the United States. It was more of a gut instinct. The instinct was, I'm as good as you, and I will not be treated like I'm second class. I remember when the cameras were on me as I was being arrested, I blurted out something about, I'm a citizen. You can't do this. That's how I felt. I felt like, and when I said a citizen, what I meant was someone who's equal and should have the same rights as everyone else. So yeah, it was an instinctive sense of not wanting to be treated unfavourably. I've been brought up, like most Australian kids, believing I lived in a democracy. And suddenly I was confronted with the reality that as a gay man, I lived in a police state. And I just wasn't willing to accept that sudden and profoundly disturbing reality. I had to challenge it, and I did. But again, it wasn't me, or it wasn't just me. It was hundreds of other people at that time. And LGBTIQA plus people do this every day right across the world, whether the TV cameras are on them or not. They step up and challenge prejudice. I guess I'm proud to be one of the people who did that. But there are many who do that right across the world right now.
Yeah. So it was a long fight from that 1988 photo and those arrests to the eventual decriminalisation in 1997.
Yeah, almost a decade. Yeah.
Almost a decade. What are one or two of your strongest memories from that that decades-long campaign of equality?
I'll give you 100 stories.
We probably don't have time for 100.
So I'll do two, like you asked me to. One that comes to mind is one that we've actually recently celebrated. They celebrated the anniversary of. So after the arrest of Salamanca, we won the right to have our stall. Then there was an election not far after that, and there was a new government, and it put up a bill to decriminalise homosexuality, which was knocked out angrily and overwhelmingly by the state upper house, the Legislative Council. And we realised it would be a while before Parliament was ready to pass this law, so we took advantage of a new opportunity that came up at the same time, which was to take a case to the UN Human Rights Committee in Geneva, which we did. At the first few seconds we were able to do that, which was Christmas Day 1991. off we faxed our complaint. There weren't any emails then, or not available to us. And 2.5 years it took of submissions backwards and forwards between us, the Australian government, Tasmanian government, and the UN. But in April 1994, the UN Human Rights Committee faxed through to us that it had decided in our favour that these old laws violated the right to privacy, the right to equality, the right not to be discriminated against on the grounds of sexual orientation. And I can still remember getting the fax and having to call our lawyers just to make sure that I'd read it right, our legal advisors, and then planning for the release of this. So that was Friday night. We released it Monday morning, which was April the 11th, which is also my birthday by coincidence. And yes, and I still remember the joy of being able to sit there with others in the what was now called the Tasmanian Gay and Lesbian Rights Group, and talking about the importance of this decision and calling on the federal government to act and calling for the laws to change, and knowing that this was going to change the debate, that it was going to move it away from all those old nonsense about, gay sex being immoral or unnatural, and refocus on it where it needed to be, which is on human rights. And it did, which was fantastic. So that was a really important moment. And when I said before that we'd celebrated that, April this year was the 30th anniversary. Wow. And we unveiled a panel in the Salamanca Arts Centre in Hobart, which is where we had our original press conference, the one where we were so happy. And we were able to commemorate in that panel and in the launch of it, the unveiling of it, the fact that not only did that UN decision lead to the Tasmanian laws changing, that Tasmanian UN decision has also led to decriminalisation in countries across the world. That was the first time the UN had condemned laws against homosexuality. It was the first time the UN had said that international human rights law covers sexual orientation, that basically gay rights are human rights. It was the first time that had ever happened. And since the Tasmanian decision in 1994, that has played a really important role as a precedent in courts and parliaments across the world overturning laws similar to Tasmania. So we're talking about places like Fiji, India, Botswana, Malawi, Belize, the list goes on. Cyprus, the list goes on. All of those places inherited similar laws from the British Empire in the 19th century. And in the 21st century, it was the Tasmanian battle against those laws and the Tasmanian UN decision which helped remove the criminal stigma from tens of millions of LGBTIQA plus people. That's something I think all Tasmanians should be really proud of. So that was moment one, that press conference.
That's got to be right up there.
Yeah. Moment two, even though we won the right to have our stall at Salamanca, the council gave in because the protests grew so large. There was still a lot of opposition to decriminalisation in Tasmania. I mentioned how the state upper house was overwhelmingly against decriminalisation. And there were a number of people in the community who were too, angrily, fiercely against, passionately against. And in 1989, to protest against government legislation that failed in the upper house. And again in 1994 to protest against any federal intervention in Tasmania after the UN decision, there were these large anti-gay rallies that were held across the state. Big ones in Burnie, Launceston and Hobart, smaller ones in Smithton, St Helens, Huonville, all over the place. These meetings were convened, and we would hire a bus in Hobart, drive to Launceston or wherever, pick up other people, and then drive to wherever the rally was, and we'd stand outside with our banners and our handouts and our little candles with vigils, for equality or whatever it was, asking people to actually talk to us and not be afraid of us, that we weren't the threat that they feared we were. It's kind of like freedom rides. And I still remember at the first time we came to protest outside an anti-gay rally in Burnie. It was very large. It was in the Civic Centre here, and there was probably 1,000 people who came. Yeah, and it was really angry. They were fired up by speakers who said the most outrageous things about gay men especially, and the threat that we posed to Tasmania. And I still remember there was this elderly fellow who came up and, I was apprehensive. He came up to us. I was a bit apprehensive because most of the people inside were fairly elderly, and I thought maybe he's going to have a go at us. But he came up and he said, "My name's Tom. I was a veteran. I'm a veteran. I fought for Australia." He was a veteran of World War II, so he would have been quite elderly at that stage. He said, "I fought for an Australia where everyone's treated with dignity and respect. Can I stand with you?" And I said, "You certainly may." Here you go. And he was quite well known in Burnie, and lots of people come up and would say, "Hi, Tom, what are you standing there for with the puffs?" And he'd go, "I'm here for equality, and for everyone being treated well." And he'd say that to everyone who challenged him, and there were quite a few people who did. There were a lot of moments like that where people decided to cross the line because they couldn't stand with bigotry and hatred. But that one stands out because of the way he tied it to, our national ideals and what he'd fought for.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah, I'll never forget Tom.
So that was the fight for a decade.
Yeah.
And then decriminalisation happened, passed, and then you kept going. Tell me about that decision and what was the next fight?
Well, I did make a decision, yes, because that was a big hurdle that we jumped, having those laws repealed. And obviously I had a choice in front of me. Do I continue this work or do I just step aside and take up a normal life? The reason that I continued was because I felt that there was a huge potential for positive change in Tasmania. I'd already seen that. When we started our campaign for decriminalisation way back in '88, people had said, "Oh, don't bother, Tasmania will never change. It's too hard. You'll never succeed. Focus on something else. You're on a fool's errand." Obviously, we didn't believe that. But the fact that we'd achieved decriminalisation and a whole lot of things along the way, including the UN decision and federal intervention and the High Court case and all these other things, and also had reached so many people in the community and changed so many hearts and minds, because the opinion polls, we took opinion polls every year, so we knew that opinion was shifting every year. When we were being arrested at Salamanca, it was Tasmanian opinion on decriminalisation, Tasmanian support for decriminalisation was 15% below the national average. By the time we finished, it was 15% above. So clearly we were doing something right. And I thought, well, it's not enough that we've helped bring Tasmania to the same position as the other states, because Tasmania was last. All the other states had changed their laws years before. It's not enough. There's obviously a lot of potential here for change. We can continue to make positive change. We need to build on this to try and create a Tasmania that's as inclusive and equal as possible. I could step away now and I'll go off and do something else, or I could use the skills I've acquired and the the hope that I've been instilled with to continue to make change. So I decided I would continue to work on change. The time it had taken to achieve decriminalisation meant that we were behind on a lot of other things in Tasmania. We didn't have an Anti-Discrimination Act. We hadn't been talking about recognising same-sex relationships because the focus had been on decriminalisation. I also felt like I had a duty to, be involved in trying to achieve those reforms. And so, that's what I went off and did, together with others, was have those reforms passed. That occurred very quickly after the decriminalisation. It was as if, to use a Tasmanian metaphor, it was as if a dam burst and outflowed all of this great legislation, and also government policy. It had been really behind. Education's a good example. In 1994, in response to the UN decision, the Secretary of the Education Department had issued a memorandum saying there was to be no discussion of homosexuality in schools. If a teacher was approached by a kid who'd say, "I'm gay," the teacher was not to respond. No posters, no books, nothing. It was those kinds of repressive policies that we had to overturn, as well as these new laws that we wanted to have enacted. So off we went. And the Anti-Discrimination Act was passed in 1998, and then the Relationships Act a couple of years later, which included Australia's first civil partnership scheme. We formed a LGBT, initially lesbian and gay, and then it expanded, reference group in the Education Department to try and to get rid of those old policies and put in place new inclusive policies. And so it went from there. There was a lot of potential. We could all see that potential, and we wanted to be part of it. We wanted to make it, we wanted Tasmania to reach its full potential of inclusion. So, that's why I didn't step back then.
And how's that normal life being running next to that or with that?
Well, maybe I shouldn't have used the term normal life because now this feels like my normal life. I guess my life hasn't been like many other people's, but I'm more than happy with the decisions I've made. Yeah. If I hadn't have got onto this track in life, the track probably would have been being a history lecturer or something like that in university, which would have been great. But I still find ways to indulge my interest in history, both queer history and history more broadly, without the need to mark exams or teach kids. So
It was a bonus.
Yeah.
So you were also the National Director of Marriage Equality.
Yep.
Why did you become involved in that campaign, and what was your role?
So marriage equality came up only a few years after decriminalisation in Tasmania. I'd worked on those other reforms, like I said, the anti-discrimination reform and the recognition of relationships at a state level, adoption reform and other parenting reforms, access to reproductive technology, that kind of stuff. All those reforms I'd worked on. And then along came marriage equality. My interest in that issue was, it was partly about the prejudices and stigma that's still associated with same-sex relationships. Even though they weren't criminalised anymore in any Australian state, still there was a lot of prejudice, a lot of stereotypes about gay and lesbian relationships, particularly gay male relationships, that the stereotype was that they were unstable and entirely sexual, that there was no real commitment, that there was no real love. It seemed to me that marriage equality and making a case for marriage equality was a way to challenge those stereotypes, because marriage is about commitment and love. I mentioned earlier about being a citizen, about being treated equally. It was that was also there. That instinctive response I had at Salamanca Market, where I said to the policeman, "I'm a citizen. You can't do this." I felt the same about marriage. I'm a citizen. You can't take that right away from me, which is what John Howard tried to do in 2004, or what he did, when he amended the Marriage Act to make it clear that same-sex relationships wouldn't be recognised. And in response to that, I formed Australian Marriage Equality, got a bunch of people together on a phone link across the nation, no video links back then, and you can see a thread here of technological change. And we could send emails by this stage, but still no video conferencing. And we formed Australian Marriage Equality and went from there, making the case for why we needed this reform, lobbying, advocating, educating people, all the same stuff we did with decriminalisation, including telling personal stories. That was really critical. I'd learnt the value of personal stories in the decriminalisation campaign, because we went out to sports clubs, service clubs, school groups, union groups, anyone who'd listen across Tassie, to explain why this reform mattered, and we'd talk about why, what it was like not being accepted in the place that you'd grown up in, or that, and that had shaped who you are. It was the same with marriage equality. We talked about what it felt like to be denied participation in this institution, marriage, that creates kinship, that is so intimately associated with family and belonging. So that was a major part of that campaign. And I having seen the value of that in Tasmania, I tried to make sure, I made sure it was part of this national campaign as well. My role in Australian marriage equality was to do basically everything. No, that's the wrong word. Anything that was necessary. Yeah. So I would, I'd do the media and I'd organise the media and organise the lobbying and organise the advocacy and trips to various places. So we went all over Australia, having workshops for people about how to tell their personal stories in regards to marriage, having public meetings, town halls, doing stand-up media conferences for local media. There are very few towns in Australia I haven't been to. That took a long time, over many years. But again, like with Tasmania, we could see from the opinion polls that public support was changing every year. It was going up and up and up. It had started really low. From memory, I think the first poll done was by SBS in 2004, and it was 34%. But we could see it every year shifting, going up and up and up. It wasn't only our work that made a difference. Obviously, the fact that other countries were changing made a big difference. New Zealand, the most. That was very embarrassing for a lot of people. That New Zealand had marriage equality and we didn't, as did the US, as did Britain, as did France, as did Germany, as did Argentina, and the list went on and on and on. And there were big events too, like stars coming out in support of marriage equality and celebrities and whatnot. So all of this contributed to this gradual increase. I know a lot of people think that the postal survey in 2017 was when marriage equality was clinched. And yeah, we had to have that postal survey according to the government of the time. I didn't want it, but they wanted it, and they're the government, so we had to go through it. But I think if it hadn't have been for that decade or more work beforehand, doing this grassroots work, then that figure of 61.4% would have been lower, significantly lower. So yeah, etched in my memory are all the milestones in that campaign. When the Geelong Football Club became the first AFL club to come out in favour of marriage equality. When Same-sex marriage bill was introduced into the Tasmanian Parliament and passed by our lower house. First time that had occurred in Australia. When the ACT Assembly did the same thing, it became law and 37 couples were able to get married under a marriage law in the ACT before the federal government stepped in and overrode it. Like I said, New Zealand passing marriage equality, that was a big one. I still remember I did 41 media interviews that day.
Wow, 41.
41. I'll never forget that figure. 41. That was exhausting. The big trips that we'd get people from all over Australia, couples, their families, clergy, marriage celebrants, all these people who supported marriage equality would converge on Parliament House in Canberra. And they break into teams, state teams, and go off and lobby their representatives from their particular states. Big logistical exercises, but lots of fun as well. And like I said, the workshops that we did. I remember one in Adelaide. And these are workshops about how to tell your stories and how to lobby politicians. And this little old lady came up to me halfway through and she said, "I don't have a personal story to tell." And I said, "Well, why are you here?" And she said, "Well, my grandson, he's gay and he's the president of the Bar Association of South Australia, and he does all this work for free for Aboriginal people who can't afford legal representatives. Represents them in court, and it's just not fair that the law won't recognise him." And I said, "Well, there's your story." That your grandson does all this work for the law and for disadvantaged people, but the law won't treat him treat him equally. And she goes, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that." Yes. So off she went to Christopher Pyne, I think it was, and a few other South Australian members to make her case. It's those interactions that you never forget. There was, I promise this will be the last story. I was addressing a town hall meeting in Goulburn in New South Wales. It was the middle of winter. It was really drafty and really cold, even for a Tasmanian. And I made the case that, as I said a moment ago, that marriage is... It's about equality, but not just about equality, because marriage is about kinship and participation in family life and a sense of belonging to family. And afterwards, this elderly man came up to me and he said, "Oh, you don't know me, but I work for a particularly conservative senator who's very much against this reform. And I came here tonight to be outraged by what you've said, but I agree." I'd never heard anyone, he said, I'd never heard people talking about family like that and marriage and family being linked and the importance of participating in family life. He said, "You're right. You've changed my mind." As someone who's an advocate, does a lot of advocacy and lobbying, to have someone say to you, "You've changed my mind," that's unforgettable. Particularly someone who had a very negative view previously. It's a reminder that I think for all of us that you should never wipe anyone off. Even if they're from a different background and they have different values, different outlooks, there's always a way, I think, to build a bridge to someone who is acting in good faith, which I think he was. He wanted to hear the arguments and he wanted to take them on their merits, even though that's not what he was expecting. What I said. Yes, you can. There's always a way to build a bridge, and you should try and do that. Not wipe people off, not get angry at them as much as you'd like to, not dismiss them, because what's that going to change? That's just going to entrench the difference. You've got to find what you've got in common, build a bridge to them, and let your experience of the world and your aspiration for change walk across that bridge.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yes, I'll say it is difficult sometimes.
Understand that frustration and that anger. Of course I felt that. It's only natural. But reflecting on the usefulness of expressing that is a good idea. That's my advice to everyone. Is yelling at someone or turning around and walking away, is that always the best thing? Or might you have something in common with that person that allows you to for them to begin to walk in your shoes? I'm not saying, I understand that some people's situation is awful and that they, that they may not feel able to do that. But don't get into the habit of walking away. Don't get into the habit of dismissing someone and calling them a bigot and leaving it alone. Look for those occasions where you think there's a possibility of change and work on it. There's nothing more empowering and more fulfilling than working for change and seeing that it actually happens. That's much more emotionally satisfying than just getting angry at someone. Much more.
For sure. So you're with Equality Tasmania now. Can you tell me a bit about Equality Tasmania and what your role is in that organisation?
Well, Equality Tasmania is the outgrowth of, or the descendant of that Tasmanian gay law reform group that I mentioned at the beginning that we formed in 1988. Tasmanian Gay Law Reform Group became the Tasmanian Gay and Lesbian Rights Group, and then in 2018, 30 years after Salamanca, it became Equality Tas. So it's essentially the same organisation, and therefore the longest lived, the oldest queer rights organisation in Australia.
It's amazing.
Yeah, yay, go Tas. And we continue to deal chiefly with law reform and lobbying and advocacy, as opposed to, say, working it out, which deals with support and training, education. Equality Tas has a board, and I was the president for 3 or 4 years after we changed our name in 2018. But now I do policy development work for the organisation. I still do advocacy and lobbying on the law reforms that we're dealing with today, like banning conversion practices. But I also work more on giving government advice on LGBTIQA plus issues through the various reference groups that we've got in Tasmania. There's one for police, the police department, one for the health department, justice, education, and a whole of government group. And those groups are working on a wide variety of different issues. Everything from how we deal with trans prisoners in the prison, trans people in prisons in Tasmania, through to how we support intersex kids in state schools, through to training for health service providers in LGBTIQA plus inclusion, and everything in between. And there's a lot of work to be done there, and I have got, as a policy development officer, I've got to focus on that, as well as advising other parts of the Tasmanian government and also local government on being more inclusive.
So you're not busy?
No. No. I've got a bit of an addiction to being busy. Sadly, I can't shake that one. I've tried. Doesn't work.
I wouldn't know anything about that. So I think you're also involved with another organisation, Just Equal Australia, the national advocacy body.
Yeah.
And what do you work on with them?
Yes, because the Tasmanian work isn't enough. My work with Just Equal, Just Equal Australia is a national organisation of people from around the country who are on a board, national board. It came out of the marriage equality debate. When the federal government wanted us to have a plebiscite, and Australian Marriage Equality, which was the organisation I founded in 2004, was gearing up to fight that plebiscite. There was no one really left to fight against the idea of a plebiscite because our community didn't want one. That was clear. And we did research work that showed that was very clear. So a bunch of us left Australian Marriage Equality to fight against the postal survey, the plebiscite, sorry. which we did successfully. We stopped it in the Senate. And then the government came up with the idea of the postal survey. And we tried to stop that in the High Court, but failed. And so we got the postal survey. And then we went on to continue to advocate on other national issues with a focus on representing the community. So what does the community actually want? What are its priorities? What kind of reform does it want? Because often, even when governments move forward on reform, they'll do it in ways which aren't appropriate, or they'll put forward half-baked law reform or compromise law reform. So as with the plebiscite, we'd ask our community, like, do you want this? Do you want to do it this way? Do you want this kind of law reform? To see what people's responses are, so we can go to decision makers and say, now our community wants full equality, they're not half. Our community doesn't want it done that way, it wants it done this way. So that's been our role over the last few years. And at the moment, and we've had a number of successes. For instance, under this government, the current, like the Albanese government, we've managed to secure protections for trans and intersex people in the workplace under the Fair Work Act. And we're currently working on other discrimination issues, for example, removing the exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act that allow LGBTIQA plus people in faith-based schools and services to be discriminated against. One of the cases we make is that at a state level in Tasmania, and also more recently in Victoria, the ACT, Northern Territory, there are no exemptions. Discrimination is against the law. So why can't it be against the law at the national level? We're making the case for a national LGBTIQA plus human rights commissioner, because we don't have one. There's no national voice for our community at the Human Rights Commission. We're working on blood donation because currently gay men and also bisexual men and transgender women who have sex with men can't give blood. So a wide range of issues. I mentioned how we do opinion polls or surveys within our community. One that's open right now, and which people can go to our webpage, equal.org.au, and fill out, is a survey on what people feel about police, political parties, religious groups, etc., and their participation in pride events. That's been a big issue, obviously, with the police in Mardi Gras, etc. And again, we wanted to know what the community felt. Too often on issues like police participation in pride parades, there'll be voices which are familiar and expected, arguing one way or the other, but there's no attempt to gain the view of the community. What do we actually want as a community? And that's what the objective of this survey is. Like I said, we do these surveys regularly on different issues to try and figure out what it is our community actually wants, coming out of that initial concern back in 2016 about the marriage plebiscite.
Yeah. We can put links to that on the show notes as well. So.
Yeah. I'd be very pleased if people could fill that out, especially Tasmanians. I'm not sure that there's a big Tasmanian response to that national survey yet. So if you haven't filled it out already, please do.
Earlier, you alluded to Tasmania having some fantastic protections, but it's not just fantastic, it's some of the best in the world, right?
Yeah, that's true. Our Anti-Discrimination Act, which came in to law not long after decriminalisation, had then and still has the strongest protections from discrimination for LGBTIQA plus people in the country. There's no exemptions for faith-based schools or services. There never have been. So if an LGBTIQA plus person experiences discrimination at a faith-based school or by a service, then they can take a case to the Anti-Discrimination Commission. That wasn't the case in any other state until the last couple of years. With our relationship laws, they're the best in the country. We were the first state to have a civil partnership scheme. We were also the first state to recognise overseas same-sex marriages and to try and have state same-sex marriages. More recently, Tasmania has passed the best gender recognition laws, not only in Australia but in the world. They allow people to change their gender identification on official documents like birth certificates without any medical involvement. Just it's self-identification, and you can even take gender off your birth certificate if you want to. And what we've found is that not only older trans and gender diverse people are doing that, but young heterosexual couples having kids are also deciding not to put gender on the birth certificate of their child. I mean, it's still recorded for the purposes of by the Bureau of Statistics, but and by state health authorities, but it's not on the birth certificate, so that the potential for their child in terms of their gender identification isn't limited. Amazing. These laws are amazing, and they're working really well, much to the annoyance of those who oppose the idea of trans people being able to identify and have their gender affirmed. My belief that Tasmania, after decriminalisation, my belief that Tasmania could go on and become a more inclusive and equal society, I think that's been borne out. And today, even though I'm getting on a bit, I believe that there's nothing that has to stop us from being the most inclusive and equal society for LGBTIQA plus people in the world. I don't see why we can't be that. We've come so far in such a short time. We've leapfrogged the other states, going from worst in the 1990s to best now. If we can be the best in Australia, why can't we be the best in the world? I think that's something that we should explicitly aim at. That's what our community wants. We don't want any more prejudice, no more discrimination, no more exclusion. Those things don't have to exist. They're not inevitabilities. We don't have to accept them as part of our lives. Tasmania can be a beacon to the world.
I always felt that after the marriage equality went through, that there was this pushback for religious freedoms.
Yeah.
And that's what inspired me to start doing, queer life stories and creating Northwest Pride and really getting involved in the community at all, was that threat.
I was naive about what would come after marriage equality, because I've been involved in decriminalisation in Tasmania. I'd been part of achieving that reform, and then I'd seen Tasmania change for the better with these new laws, and it was just up and up and up. And I thought the same would happen with marriage equality, and I was wrong. I think marriage equality did go a long way to removing the stigma and stereotypes of same-sex relationships. Obviously, there's still prejudice there, but much less than there used to be, I find. So it did have that positive effect. And, of course, people can get married, which is great. But there's been a backlash to marriage equality that we didn't see to decriminalisation, at least not in Tasmania. A backlash that I didn't expect, and which really has... The depth of it has shocked me, and really made me sit back and reassess what the timescales for change for LGBTIQA plus people and our rights. I guess I was under the naive assumption that we were talking about decades, 1 or 2 decades. We're not. We're talking about centuries. The wheel turns and then we're up the top and it's great, but then it'll turn again and we'll be plunged down into the mud. We have to keep pushing. That wheel must turn many times before we get rid of prejudice and discrimination. So what I'm talking about, of course, is what you've mentioned already, the push for religious freedom, as well as the backlash against trans people. We'll come to that in a minute. But in terms of religious freedom, so after marriage equality was achieved in the United States in 2015 through the US Supreme Court decision, it made marriage equality the law of the whole of the US, those who opposed marriage equality changed tack. That reform was going to stay, obviously. They couldn't change that. So what they did instead was took aim at discrimination protections against our community and tried to roll them back in the name of religious freedom. Basically the case is that the case that was made then was about marriage service providers, wedding service providers. That's how the two issues were linked, marriage equality and religious freedom. So suddenly the attention was on bakers, and anti-discrimination law would mean they couldn't refuse to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. But people would come along, the religious freedom advocates, and say, well, that violates their religious freedom. They should be able to say on religious grounds that they don't want to do that. Same with the county clerks who were registering same-sex marriages. There was one in Kentucky who said, no, I shouldn't have to do that. My religious freedom is being violated, even though that's my actual job. And suddenly those who are discriminating against us are taking the posture of victims. We're victims of this gay marriage juggernaut. Our rights are being taken away. It's not fair. And we have the emergence of this religious freedom narrative that says that Christians are being persecuted by the state that's in alliance with the gay community, and they need protections too. We've given gay people protections, the Christians need protections. Now, of course, and so that's the narrative, and of course it's disingenuous. The county clerk or the baker, they're not being disadvantaged by laws which say that everyone should be treated equally. They can't show any material disadvantage. They're not being discriminated against in the traditional sense. They're not losing their religious freedoms in the traditional sense. The idea of religious freedom that came to us from the Enlightenment in Europe in the 18th century was the idea that people should be able to worship freely and shouldn't have the state tell them, oh no, you have to be a Protestant or a Catholic or whatever. You're not allowed to be anything that we tell you, that we don't, other than what we tell you. That's what religious freedom meant, but suddenly that's been twisted around into justifying not serving same-sex couples, not treating same-sex couples the same as everyone else. That's, like I said, not what religious freedom means. It's a perversion of that idea in order to justify discrimination against LGBTIQA plus people. And I'd almost go so far as to say to justify segregation, because that's what segregation, certainly in the US, was. Denial of services to people because of the colour of their skin. This is denial of services to people because of their sexual orientation. But that idea of religious freedom being violated grew and grew and grew, well beyond wedding service providers. And now it's come to mean anyone who doesn't want to have anything to do with LGBTIQA plus people. And we saw we can see this in the US, and we saw it in Australia too. So the idea of religious freedom being violated jumped the Pacific in 2015 and was sort of the main argument made against marriage equality in the last 2 years of that debate. And then we saw it take the form of Scott Morrison's religious discrimination bill. And that bill was a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So it said that pharmacists should have the religious freedom, in inverted commas, not to sell contraception if that was against their religious belief, even though that's their job. And so, women or people who are accessing contraception, particularly in small towns where there's only one pharmacy, will be disadvantaged by that. They're being discriminated against. But no, the pharmacists should have religious freedom. Doctors should have religious freedom to not serve LGBTIQA plus people, not have us as clients if they feel that our quote lifestyles are objectionable. This was all part of that bill, and of course, religious schools and services should have the right to discriminate against LGBTQI plus people if that's what their religious ethos dictates. And that's why that bill, that federal bill from Scott Morrison, directly overrode the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act, the act that, like I said earlier, had protected LGBTIQA plus people in religious schools and services for 2 decades without the sky falling in. Suddenly we had this federal legislation that was going to override it in the name of religious freedom. People will remember the Folau case, Israel Folau, the rugby player, and his tweet that was homophobic. Same thing. People should have the religious freedom to say whatever they want, even if that contravenes existing hate speech laws, as was the case in Tasmania, because we have strong hate speech laws. And again, that federal law, the religious discrimination bill, was going to override the state law and water down our hate speech protections, just so a rugby player in Sydney could say whatever he liked on Twitter. The religious freedom narrative is, like I said, disingenuous. It's a perversion of what religious freedom really is, and it's designed to attack the rights of LGBTIQA plus people. With that Scott Morrison bill, the Religious Discrimination Act, we were able to show that the watering down that he wanted in our state laws, overriding our state laws, would not only affect LGBTIQA plus people, but also people with disability, people from minority faiths, workers, businesses, women in terms of getting hold of health services, including reproductive health care, all these different groups. And we were able to form a coalition of groups that stood up to that bill that included the Migrant Resource Centre and Disability Voices Tasmania and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry and Unions Tasmania and the Women's Health Centre. And they were all able to say, this bill affects all of us equally. It's not God versus the gays. It's about taking away the rights of all of these people. And that was a really, really effective, I think, in undermining the legitimacy of that legislation and exposing the disingenuousness of that line, that religious freedom is at stake. That bill was said by Scott Morrison to be about protecting people of faith from discrimination. But what it actually did was that it allowed discrimination in the name of faith, which is a very different thing. Unfortunately, because we were able to point that out and point out how many people it affected, the bill was lost and disappeared. Unfortunately, the narrative that we queer people are still some kind of threat to religious freedom, even though we're not, that's still out there. So I imagine that we will see a return to this idea in state or federal parliament, sometime soon. There have been attempts to water down the State Anti-Discrimination Act before in the name of religious freedom. I think that we'll see that again. and we'll probably see the return of some kind of religious discrimination bill. So that threat hasn't gone away. It's receded for now, but it'll come back. And we need to be forming those coalitions again in order to fight it and pointing out exactly what this is, an attempt to allow discrimination against vulnerable people in the name of religion.
You said religious freedom was one of the pushbacks after marriage equality.
Yeah.
The other was the increase in attacks against gender diverse and trans folk, both online, in person.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about what's happening?
Yes. Again, in the US, after marriage equality, we saw this sudden uptick in antagonism towards trans people that took a lot of people by surprise. Like, where did this come from? Why is this happening now? And again, I think it was because they could no longer attack same-sex partners in the way they had been, those who opposed same-sex marriage. So they found a new and what in their view was weaker target. And some of them have actually said that quite a bit out loud. They've actually said, we can't attack gay and lesbian people like we used to because they're more legitimate now, so we will attack trans people instead. And the attacks began, in the US at least, in terms of bathroom bills. So these bills that that prevented trans women from going into the bathrooms that are conform to their gender identity, because that was somehow a threat to other women. That expanded to change rooms, and then the debate expanded further to trying to stop gender-affirming care for young people. And we've seen in the US some awful legislation pass. In Australia, there have been attempts at legislation. People have flagged or tried to get up the issue of stopping gender-affirming care for young people, or stopping trans women playing women's sport. That's been a big one in Australia. So far, the legislation has failed, and attempts to try and reverse the situation have failed. But the online hate especially has just escalated. And, you know, anyone can see it. I cop some of it, and I'm sure you do too, as we stand up for trans and gender diverse people. I find a lot of it comes from the US and Britain, but there's still plenty that comes from Australia. And it's awful. I find it hard to understand how trans and gender diverse people deal with it sometimes, and it's increased my admiration for their resilience, their bravery. Equality Tasmania has been, trying to do as much as we can to deal with this. I mentioned the legislation that was passed a couple of years ago about gender recognition, which was a big step forward. We do what we can in terms of community education, especially educating MPs. Just last week, we had a briefing in Parliament for MPs about gender-affirming care for young people, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about that. And so we had trans people, parents of trans kids, and also doctors who have a big trans client base, patient base. We had them all in there briefing MPs about what the reality is, the benefits of affirming care, the misinformation, countering the misinformation that's out there. And that seemed to be quite effective. Working It Out has also had a forum in Parliament House where similar information was put out, which is great. That was a couple of months ago. So we're all doing as much as we can to try and inform MPs in the broader community about what the reality is. But it's not easy. It feels to me a lot like the situation in the early 90s in Tasmania in regards to gay men and lesbians. Lots of misinformation, lots of attempts to try and portray us as this huge threat to society, a threat to children. All the arguments that we hear now in terms of trans people about grooming and threat to kids, it's just a phase. That's just so familiar. It's all the arguments that used to be made about gay men and lesbians recycled. Yeah. That's why I find it so hard to understand when I come across gay, lesbian or bi people who are anti-trans. That makes no sense to me. I mean, our struggles are closely linked, closely interlinked. But if you can't see how all of the anti-gay stereotypes are now being recycled, then you're blind. And also, if you can't see that a lot of the anti-trans campaigning that happens now is a doorway back into homophobia. And we're seeing that in the US. So after marriage equality, the focus was just on trans people. But now we can see that stuff expanding to take in gay and lesbian people again. And the perfect example is the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. It doesn't just ban trans material from schools, it also bans gay and lesbian material. To those who are against us, it doesn't matter whether the flag has white, blue and pink stripes or whether it's got rainbow stripes. It's all the same to them. Yeah. And they'll use any opportunity they can to attack all of us.
Fighting for a ban of conversion practices has been a topic that has been discussed for quite a while in Tasmania. Why is this so important? And where are we up to with getting this ban in place in Tasmania?
Banning conversion practices is important because, A, they still happen, and many people, including many queer people, are under the misconception they don't. We know that they're happening right now. Somewhere in Tasmania, as I speak, there'll be a young same-sex attracted or person or a young trans person who's going through one of these programs, who's sitting there poring over a manual, worrying about who they are and trying to fix it, in inverted commas. National and Tasmanian research indicates that 5% of LGBTIQA plus people have been through conversion practices in the last 2 years. And some Tasmanian faith leaders have said that they actually continue to practice this. They've openly admitted it. So it's happening. The second reason is that we know from national and local research that conversion practices have a deeply traumatic impact on the people who go through them. They're more like 3 to 4 times more likely to have PTSD and to have attempted suicide. More likely than other LGBTIQA plus people who already have elevated levels, on average, of mental health risk. So there's a huge risk there, mental health risk. That's why we need to stop it. In Tasmania, it's like many issues in Tasmania, it's become hotly debated and very controversial, more so than in the other states. The Tasmanian Law Reform Institute did some research into it. They recommended a ban in 2022. The government promised to introduce legislation. It unveiled a bill last year in December, which was not very good. It wouldn't really stop conversion practices at all. So we said, you need to go back to the drawing board. We haven't heard from the government since. But there are people in Parliament now who are looking at doing an alternative and one that will actually do the job. Similar, say, to the Victorian legislation, which is very good. If we're not careful, soon will be the last state, again, like we were with criminalising homosexuality. Conversion practices are banned in some form or another in Victoria, the ACT, New South Wales, Queensland, soon in South Australia and Western Australia. So we need to get our act together. I'm hopeful that we'll see legislation before the end of the year, touch wood. Critical to achieving reform or to how far we've come and to finally achieving it are the stories of conversion survivors. And I tip my hat to Tasmanian survivors who have stood up and told their stories again and again, even though that's really traumatic for them, in the media and to MPs. Bron Larkins and Glenn Worrell and Irene Harris, they've done such a great job. Without them, we could not have come this far. If there's anyone listening who has been through conversion practices and who wants to tell their story, it can be anonymous if they want. Then please contact me, because the more stories we have, the more pressure we can bring to bear on MPs to actually pass legislation that will work.
So another issue that come up, and I think it's one of the first things that you and I ever spoke about a few years back, was blood donation restrictions. Where are we with that?
We're making some progress, which is great. The current situation, as people may be aware, is that if you're a gay man in a relationship, or if you're a bisexual man or a transgender woman who is in a relationship with a man, you have to be sexually abstinent for 3 months before you can give blood. It's effectively a ban on our blood. That's not a good situation. It's discriminatory, and it also means that there's less blood available for those Australians who need it. The Red Cross Lifeblood Service keeps telling us that there's shortages, including in winter when lots of people stay away from blood donation because they've got colds or flu. If we were able to donate, then we will be able to help increase the supply of safe blood. A couple of years ago, a group formed, Let Us Give, which is sort of affiliated with Just Equal Australia. I'm part of that. And we've been able to do some really good advocacy around this issue, including to Lifeblood and to the government. And we've helped push Lifeblood in the direction of lifting that ban and instead adopting a new system which is called individual risk assessment. So everyone gets asked the same question about their sexual risk. It doesn't matter if they're gay or straight or cis or trans. It's the same question for everyone. And it means that if you're a gay man or a bi and trans person who's safe to give blood, then you can go through. You don't have to be celibate for 3 months. It's the system that applies in Britain, Canada, the US, France, Germany, and an increasing number of countries. Initially, Lifeblood was resistant to this, and it said, well, you can give blood plasma, that's the yellow stuff, because that there's no risk there, because that stuff stores for longer and it's easier to test and it can be irradiated for pathogens. But whole blood they weren't so keen on. Now they've changed their mind from Boxing Day last year. So 8 months ago, Lifeblood said, okay, yes, we agree that you can give blood. And we put in so many submissions and highlighted the medical evidence from right around the world. There are studies that have been done on this in the countries that I've mentioned before to show that there is no heightened risk from allowing gay blood donation under an individual risk assessment scheme. And finally, Lifeblood said yes, so that was great. And at the end of last month, I think, end of July, from what I know, Lifeblood put a submission into the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the national oversight body, independent body, asking the TGA to approve this new system. That usually takes a while, assuming that they agree, it probably won't come into force until the end of next year at the earliest. A lot of things need to be changed, the forms and the training, and assuming that they agree. There is one problem with the with Lifeblood's submission. Now, I said before that what we want is an individual risk assessment system. And what that means is that when you go in, no matter who you are, you're asked, have you had anal sex with new or multiple partners in the last 3 months? Because that's the risk factor, multiple partners, anal sex. And if you haven't, then you can give blood. So basically, if you're in a monogamous gay relationship, or if you haven't had anal sex, then you can give blood. And if you answer that you have had anal sex with a new partner or multiple partners in the last 3 months, then you need to wait. And the wait period should be 3 months, because that's what it is now. Lifeblood has asked for that to be 6 months. And we've asked Lifeblood why. It hasn't been able to give a good reason. It doesn't make any sense because it would exclude people who can currently give blood. 6 months isn't necessary. The whole reason for these abstinence periods is because of what's called the window period with HIV infection. So you can be infected with HIV and not know it, and it won't show up on tests for a few days after the infection. It could be up to a fortnight. So if you give blood within that window period, then it's not going to show up on the tests. That's what we're worried about. But having 6 months is completely unnecessary. 3 months is already way too much to get within that window period to make sure that people don't donate in that window period. So Let Us Give has put in a submission to the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or will soon, just saying that that's unnecessary. 6 months, 3 months is what happens in Britain, Canada, US. It should be the same here. But also supporting, of course, this new focus, which is on the actual risky activity rather than the gender of your sexual partner. We have to wait and see what the Therapeutic Goods Administration will do. And my hope is that it will lift the current ban and focus instead on risky sexual activity. And when it does, there will be a 3-month deferral period, not a 6-month one. We'll just have to wait and see.
Fingers crossed.
But we are making progress, and I'm pleased that we're moving forward slowly.
Yeah. Do you feel like local councils have a role to play in breaking down some stigma in the communities, creating visibility for queer folk in their council areas?
Absolutely. Local governments play a really important role in fostering more inclusive communities. We've seen this in Victoria. They've got 70-something councils there, and almost all of them now fly the rainbow flag on Ida Hobbit Day, and many of them have adopted action plans. And we're seeing the same developments in Tasmania. The leader in this is Kingborough, south of Hobart, where Kingston is, Margate, places like that. They had a community consultation and developed an action plan. It's a great action plan. It commits the council to training staff in LGBTIQA plus inclusion. The council hosted a queer film festival, I think at the beginning of this year. The council runs workshops for local businesses and how to be LGBTIQA plus inclusive, including tourism businesses. They work with local schools to make sure that those schools are inclusive. It's great. Similar plans are now being developed, I think, in Brighton, in Launceston. Launceston City Council recently voted to develop an action plan unanimously, which was great. Glenorchy, Clarence, I know Meander Valley flies the rainbow flag on Ida Hobbit Day. So does the Huon Valley and the Derwent Valley, all the valleys. In Tasmania, we're moving forward with on local government inclusion, and it does make a big difference. I know it's a kind of a cliche that local government is the closest level of government to the people, but in terms of making real change on the streets and in the shops, and in people's hearts and minds, it's true. Yep. The work that we've seen in Kingborough has made a real positive difference, and it will in the other municipalities as well. I'm hopeful that on the Northwest Coast, more councils will see what's happening and also join the movement for change.
Me too. Are there any major focuses for Equality Tasmania at the moment, apart from some of the stuff we've already talked about?
We've talked about conversion practices. Also, it's really important that we ban non-consenting, medically unnecessary interventions on infants who have variations of sex characteristics. Sometimes the word uses intersex. That's banned in the ACT. We know it still happens in Tasmania. So we're working on that. We're working on hate crime, or preventing it, on an amendment to the Sentencing Act to allow for aggravated sentences if a crime is motivated by anti-LGBTIQA plus hate. We've also got some workshops coming up at the beginning of next year on how to recognise and respond to hate crime, how to report hate crime for the LGBTIQA plus community in Tasmania. We're working on the expungement of historical LGBTIQA plus criminal records. So for those people who were convicted under our old anti-gay laws and also our old laws against cross-dressing, which were repealed in 2000, since 2017, they've had the right to apply to have their criminal record erased, which is great. The government commissioned a review of that to update it in 2020. The review made a number of recommendations, which the government accepted, except for one. So most of the recommendations were about making it a more streamlined application process, promoting the scheme more. The government's happy with that. But it's just introduced legislation that doesn't accept the final recommendation of the review, which was financial redress for those who were convicted in the past, charged and convicted. Other countries that repealed their anti-gay laws decades back have financial redress. Britain, France, Germany, Austria, places like that, but not Australia. And our argument is that the people who were arrested in the past, not only did they have to go through this horrible criminal process because of who they were, they often lost their jobs, they lost their families, some of them took their lives, of course. Many moved away, so they lost their connection to Tasmania. It was very traumatic. It caused deep disadvantage, and they deserve some recompense. There's strong support for that amongst some political parties in Parliament, even though the government doesn't support it. And so we're hopeful, touch wood, that in the next few weeks an amendment will be put forward to that legislation and will go through Parliament, allowing for that recompense, that financial redress. And if that happens, Tasmania will be the first place in Australia to do that, which I think is appropriate given we were the last place to decriminalise homosexuality and the only place to criminalise cross-dressing. We need to own up to that awful repressive legacy and address it, not just through allowing records to be erased, but through actual monetary redress. Yeah. So we're working on all those issues, the local government issues I was talking about before, trying to get change at local government level. Working with organisations like Working It Out on trying to get a mental health service in Tasmania for a dedicated LGBTIQA plus mental health service. Working on discrimination in schools. So we received quite a few complaints about discrimination from students, teachers and parents. And there's now an inquiry in State Parliament into this, and I'm encouraging people to send in submissions if they've experienced discrimination or bullying on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity or intersex status, to send in submissions to this inquiry so they can see what's really happening. If anyone's listening and they need to know more, then get in touch and I'll help you through it. There was a story recently or a report in the Advocate newspaper. It was on the front page, I think, of Lexi Rockcliffe, who endured terrible bullying at her school because she was trans. If anyone's experienced anything like that, or any kind of discrimination at all, then be like Lexi and speak up. Contact me and I can help you through the process.
I guess everything we talk about is just there's so many different layers and it can feel a bit overwhelming. What do you hope someone takes from listening to you today and turns into maybe an action?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It can seem overwhelming, all of these issues. What can members of the community do? Like I said earlier, I think many of us have stories that are pertinent to the issues I've mentioned today, and others that, of course, that we haven't got to, that will make other people sit up and think, including politicians. We may not realise we have those stories, but they're there. And so I guess I'd urge people to think, of all the issues, given all the issues I've mentioned today, is there something that's really important to you, something that you've experienced, and something that you'd like to share with others in order to make change, through an article in the newspaper or through talking to a politician or whatever it might be.
Recording a podcast.
Or in a podcast, yeah, exactly. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. If you're not comfortable being out, then you can be anonymous. That was how the conversion survivors began. Glenn Worrell, who has spoken out a lot, he wasn't confident being public, and so he started off speaking anonymously, but then that built up his confidence. And he was put his name to articles and stood in front of the TV. So yeah, if you think you might have a story that's relevant to any of the issues that we're spoken about today or any others, get in contact, and we can talk through. I can talk through, how to get that story out there, how to make a difference with the story, who to talk to, how to talk to them. I do that all the time, and obviously I like it, and I'm here to help. I know it can seem really intimidating, the idea of talking to a politician or talking to on the radio or talking on a podcast. But I've found that when people start doing it, and it's about them and their experiences, and they know that it's actually making a change, making a difference, then a lot of that fear and self-doubt go. Yeah. Anyway, so get in contact if you've got a story to share, and we can talk about how you might be able to share it.
Is there a topic or an issue maybe that we haven't talked about today that you think doesn't get enough attention?
Well, I mentioned before Equality Tas and working it out and others, working for a LGBTIQA plus mental health service. If we look at the figures, the mental health risk of LGBTIQA plus Tasmanians is higher than for LGBTIQA plus people anywhere else in Australia, arguably for any group in Australia. I think this is the legacy of anti-gay laws, anti-cross-dressing laws that were repealed here later than in other states. So, yeah, we need to be talking more about the issue of mental health risk. It's quite high in our community and unusually high in Tasmania. Another thing that we don't talk about enough is the fact that our community also faces higher levels of housing risk, and we tend to have lower income levels than other Tasmanians, and sometimes lower educational outcomes, all because of discrimination. Now that was we know this is a fact. It's not just my anecdotal evidence. We know that this is a fact from the Tasmania Project, which is an annual research project conducted by the University of Tasmania looking at educational outcomes, housing risk, income levels, all of those socio-economic indicators. And they've begun in recent years to disaggregate the data so that they're looking at the outcomes for LGBTIQA plus people consistently worse than other Tasmanians, or the average for other Tasmanians, I should say. This isn't dealt with enough. We need more focus on that, both within our community, but especially from government. And I'm doing what I can to raise the awareness of this from relevant government agencies. But the more discussion publicly there is about it, the better. We're still plagued by this pink dollar myth. This idea from the 90s, and that's when it sort of came to prominence, that the idea is, and it's all a stereotype, gay guys don't have kids, therefore they've got more money to spend, and businesses should be chasing the pink dollar. Well, some gay guys might have more money to spend, but a lot of us don't, as a result of discrimination in our lives. The same right across the board in our community, especially the case for trans and gender diverse people. So, yeah, I'd like to see us talking more about that.
I guess my last question for you is that you've been doing this for such a long time. Do you see yourself stopping anytime soon?
That was a question that I recently had to ask myself because I turned 60, which is a nice round number. And yeah, when you turn a number that have a birthday with a 0 in it, then yeah, you're going to think, am I doing what I really want to do? I think I realised then for the first time that just really hit me. You cannot do this forever. You have to stop at some point. What is that point? I still haven't answered that question. I'm not going to stop tomorrow because I really want to see through the conversion legislation, at least, and also see through the blood donation change. After that, I'm not sure. I mean, it's possible, quite possible, that I'd step back from law reform, lobbying, and that kind of advocacy. It's harder for me. It's harder for me to see myself stepping back from advocacy altogether, though, or from work within our community. One thing that I do more and more now is work on queer history. I'm working on at the moment on developing a web-based app about Tasmanian LGBTIQA plus history, which will become quite a big project, and I love that. And when I talk about a history, I'm not just talking about what I've been involved in over the last 30 years, but right back the last since invasion and before. So, and Tasmania has a very dramatic, fascinating queer history. Yeah, so I think I see myself being involved in that more and more over the next few years. Maybe less involved in law reform. But yeah, it's hard to see myself walking away from community work. Who knows what the future might hold?
Well, thank you for making time and coming in today. I've really enjoyed sitting down and having a chat about all this stuff, but I hope you will come back when you have some updates and some new things you want to talk about, and I'd love to deep dive into some queer Tasmanian history on another episode someday as well. So
Well, again, thanks for having me on. I'd love to do a queer history episode. Bring on maybe a couple of other people who are doing work in this area. Have a good chat about that. Have a in-depth discussion about conversion practices and what form they take in Tasmania nowadays with some of the survivors. More than happy to come back and talk about that stuff. And it's great what you're doing with the Queer Life Stories. It's an honour to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We've added some links to our episode notes, including to the Just Equal survey regarding police attending Pride events that Rodney mentioned. So please check out the links. You can find and follow us on Facebook under Queer Tasmania or on Instagram under Queer Tasmania Podcast. And if you'd like to get in touch about any of the topics we've covered today, please email us at wakefield_productions@outlook.com. If you have an idea that you think would make a great Queer Tasmania episode, or maybe you'd like to make your own episode to feature on the podcast, please reach out. We would love to hear from you. That's it for this week. Take care of yourself and each other.